especially in today's world, employees appreciate a CEO who accepts that they're human and that they're not all-knowing. It's okay. That means the input from the employees is that much more valuable to the way that the company is doing business.
Welcome to 5 Minutes, your quick dive into the wide-ranging world of insurance, technology, and leadership. I'm Miguel Edwards, and I'll be your guide as we explore these topics that are transforming not just the insurance industry, but the business world at large. Along with sharing observations I've made over the span of my career in insurance, technology, and operations, I'll be chatting with some of the brightest minds in business and leadership. Whether you're a seasoned executive or a rising star, an industry expert, or just curious about how technology is revolutionizing insurance, this is your perfect spot for your weekly dose of insights. This is 5 Minutes. Carol Williams from Strategic Decision Solutions. Did I get that right?
You did.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining me on the show here. Carol, just, real quick backstory. In addition to, all of the amazing things that you've accomplished as an entrepreneur and with your firm, I also, and in addition to thanking you for being on the show, I want to thank you for being a mentor, because your coaching and guidance as I kind of build my practice has been incredibly valuable. Book recommendations at all. So thank you so much for that. And thank you for joining me here and sharing a little bit about the world of ERM, which we're going to jump into here in a couple of seconds. But before we do that, please, why not just start by sharing your journey in insurance? Because it's always fascinating to hear how the heck people got involved in insurance. No one ever goes to college and says, hey, I'm going to major in insurance, right? So what was it for you? What got you into this role? Tell me a little bit about that journey, how you started SDS. Just give us the kind of the once over on the background.
Yeah, sure. So actually, I did not get my bachelor's in insurance because I did not have that mindset. But I did go for accounting. Couldn't figure out what I wanted to do with my accounting degree. Ended up working at the Florida Office of Insurance Regulation, doing company licensing, which throws you into the deep end on the insurance side. Right. So spent 5 years there doing all different kinds of roles, getting to know ins and outs of the P&C world, all the way out to the NAIC, helping with disaster reporting, everything. Mm-hmm. So, but I got tired of the regulatory space and decided I wanted an industry experience, which in Tallahassee, Florida, ends up being Citizens Property Insurance.
That's right.
But when I started working at Citizens is when I did decide I do want to go to school and learn about risk and insurance. So got my master's from FSU in risk management and insurance. And it is there that there was a class that talked about enterprise risk management, which really kind of drove me into that topic of that is what I want to do. Mm-hmm. And luckily, Citizens wanted to start an ERM program. So I got to raise my hand and say, I would love to do that. And so I got to design, implement, and then manage, later becoming the director of enterprise risk management. So at Citizens for 9 years, got to know how an insurance company works, even the residual market side, but really also getting to know the industry as a whole. It was after that is when I started Strategic Decision Solutions, really wanting to help carriers learn from my mistakes and getting to know how to do ERM well. That right. is value add without being bureaucratic.
So we're throwing around the term ERM, Carol, and I'm sure most of insurance professionals have some concept of the notion of enterprise risk management. But depending, I guess, on who you are and how you're positioned in the organization, you obviously think about that in very different ways. Give us an understanding, in terms of what is all encompassed in ERM for those of us who I'm sure have gaps in understanding.
Yeah, so enterprise risk management really does take down to the big picture of what does the company want to accomplish. And it's all about understanding what could get in your way and what are you relying on to be in place in order for you to achieve that. So a company can either take action immediately or be prepared to respond to in case because there's always uncertainty. Mm-hmm. I think you and I both recognize that as entrepreneurs and working with our clients, there's uncertainty in every decision that gets made. And so enterprise risk management is always about helping understand what that uncertainty is and be prepared for it. It is more encompassing than compliance, than reinsurance, corporate insurance, it is bigger than all of that.
So as I'm thinking about it, is it fair to say that you go through and you're categorizing the different types of risks, right? So, I mean, we've got technology risk, right? We'll actually have capacity risk. We'll have regulatory risk. Is that the right way to think about it, is kind of going all the way around the horn and identifying what all of those things that could get in your way and how do you categorize them?
That's an element of it, but first you have to understand, what is the company trying to achieve? So you have your business objectives. What are your mission critical? Every carrier has a mission that they are there to achieve for their policyholders. So what could get in the way of achieving that mission? That is one aspect. The other side is strategy. Every carrier should have a strategy. Some of them don't. We need to work on that. But every carrier should have a strategy around how do they want to take the company to the future, really driving towards that vision. And so you have uncertainty around those things that they want to accomplish as part of their strategy. So within those two avenues, what are the types of risks? Yes, to go to your point. But then there's one layer down, because you can't really respond and know what risks you're taking without knowing specifics. It really has to come down to what is the specific type of technology risk that we're talking about.
Got it.
There could be a very specific system. It could be a certain type of technology. It could be the changes, the speed at which technology is changing. There's all those different aspects change how a company makes a decision about it.
Love that. You know what just clicked for me is I think about the work that we do, and we typically approach the world, and I think this is kind of what you were getting at in terms of defining that strategy. We're approaching the world from what all has to be true in order for you to achieve your goal, right? And that's how we come up with a strategic plan. And you're saying you got to also what are the things that could compromise your ability to achieve that strategic plan? So am I connecting those dots well? I mean, that's really the concept of ERM. Perfect.
Yeah.
That makes a ton of sense.
And I'll actually say that there's a third component, and that is, what are the dependencies between the elements? So you could have some things that could be true, and then you could have some things of, there's a lot of uncertainty here, but we are relying on these other things to be in place, or these certain people to be able to do certain things, all these different dependencies that don't necessarily get identified. And you know as well as I do that assumptions get made.
Yeah.
And those assumptions are in everybody's head when they're vocalizing something. Very rarely are all of those assumptions out on the table so that everybody understands what they are. What you're going to find is that when you get all of those assumptions out on the table, people are amazed of, oh, I didn't think about that, or that is nowhere close to what I was assuming was going to, and so you end up getting everybody all on the same page, and then you get a much stronger strategy at the end of the day.
Love that. Yeah, that makes a good sense there, and that, I think it's really critical. Just even the exercise in prompting people to say, okay, what are all of the assumptions, and what all has to be true, and like having that exercise, I think is incredibly, I think, elucidating to where all of those risks might lie. Tell me, Carol, because the other thing too that it just occurred to me is like I got this blind spot in terms of this entire side of strategy that's often missed, right? What are some of the things when you walk into a carrier and you meet with executives? What are some of the gaps in thinking that you typically find as it relates to ERM? I mean, there's probably assumptions there. Oh yeah, well, we have an ERM program, and and then you get in there and then you do your work. What are some of the typical gaps that you think are important for people to be thinking about?
A lot of carriers, especially, think of reinsurance as being a major component of their ERM program. The reality is that reinsurance is a method of responding to a specific type of risk, and that is their exposure risk. And so they are transferring the risk to their reinsurers, but that is only taking care of this one sliver. And the reality is that for every carrier, that is a small sliver of risk.
That makes sense.
Not from a dollar value perspective, but when it comes to the various types of risks that are in existence. So from that perspective, there's a ton of operational side of just the business running from day to day, capacity, not just from a time perspective, but a mental perspective of their people. people can only juggle so many things at any given point before they just get exhausted and they cannot function at an optimal level. Carriers just think, the leaders, they just think, I'm just going to pile one more project. Right. And before you know it, it's the progress gets to be minimal and they don't understand why. The other piece is they think about reputation from a very certain lens.
Right.
But what they don't think about is, especially those carriers that have investors, so your stock companies that aren't privately owned by a family or whatever, you've got investors that want a very specific outcome. And there are a lot of times when that outcome is at odds with what's best for the policyholder.
Right.
And so trying to marry those two outcomes, there's a lot of risk there because you could lean heavily one towards one versus the other. And that can damage your reputation. Financially, carriers are really good at managing financial risk.
Yeah.
That is the best way to put it.
Right.
All the other risks, that's where the challenges lie, to be honest. Yeah.
That makes sense. I want to double click on the first one that you talked about, because what I heard in there was this, a dynamic around change management. And I scream from the mountaintops around the need for defined and regimented organizational change management. And I feel like you're putting a finer point on it because you're highlighting that inability to manage change and to some extent capacity. You're tying that to execution risk, right? That's kind of interesting. So is assessing, for example, a company's project portfolio part and parcel of actually even looking at the ERM portfolio?
Mm-hmm. It is, because you should only have so many goals, and it's a very small number. A lot of carriers try to do 5, 6, 7 goals at a time, and that is not realistic because the best way to think about it is a pie. And if you try, all of your activities go into this one pie for the entire company. Well, if you try to achieve 7 goals, imagine splitting that pie into 7 pieces. Mm-hmm. You can only give so much capacity and resources to those 7 goals. But if you try to achieve 1 or 2, holy smokes, you can bring so much more to bear
for sure
on each of those goals. So when you start looking at it from that perspective, say you've got 2 goals. What are the initiatives that are supporting this goal versus this goal? You can bring so much more.
Right.
And they're typically along the same lines from a topic perspective. They're related. And when they're very closely related projects, there's more synergy between them. Mm-hmm. And so it's not so disconcerting for people to work on multiple projects that are closely related.
Right.
As opposed to all the way over here where it's very jarring mentally to have to juggle 2 different projects that are so dissimilar.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that I heard in there a little bit has to do around decisioning and decision framework. So if I'm thinking about, again, that strategy element, I'm thinking about what to go after, what goals to choose, how are things aligned to those goals. Can you share how, in your experience, you've seen whether or not, and perhaps this doesn't fit, but I'm seeing perhaps is there an opportunity to use ERM to improve my decision making? Not even necessarily just even at the base level in terms of what type of risk do I take, but even in terms of what types of goals and strategy do I choose? Is that applicable?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Because when you start thinking about it from that perspective of asking all the right questions when you're setting your goals, you start seeing the diversity of goals and you start asking yourself, how are these things going to help move the needle? And I don't like using consulting terms, and I know that one's getting thrown around a lot, but move the needle towards our ultimate vision that we have for this company. And that vision should be, way out in the future. But which one of these is really going to make that progress and make it very discernible, very easily recognizable? So ERM should be asking those tough questions. And I've always had the mindset that ERM should always be about challenging assumptions and asking questions. we're going to be those people in the room asking those tough questions, and management should be okay with that, to be honest. And sometimes they don't like getting asked the questions.
Sure.
Because they know their business.
Right.
So what is ERM doing questioning me knowing my business? But we're going to ask it in a way that, well, maybe you know your business, but this is affecting the entire company. So everybody needs to know the information that's in your head. So share it with everybody else. Because everybody else may not be okay with the things that you're assuming are going to happen, or the knowledge that's in your head is totally different than where the CEO wants to go. So it's all about bringing everybody all at the same time to the same table so that you can all move towards the same goal. And that's what ERM is always meant to do. You want everybody moving in the same path, being at the same table, and understanding here are the risks, here are the opportunities. We are willing to accept these risks. We're willing to not accept these. We're going to do something, and we're going to move forward as a company because we're all on the same page then.
Love that. That's fascinating. By the way, side note, off the record session notes here. I totally remembered what that question was, and I knew it was going to happen. You brought it to me, so let me jump into it. So as we start thinking about enumerating all of these risks, whether it's around execution, et cetera, or kind of our product portfolio risk, so on and so forth. One of the things that I've been incredibly used to as a technologist is I've been used to just this very simple 2x2 grid in terms of what's the likelihood and versus what's the impact of a particular risk for materializing, right? So it's a high likelihood, low likelihood, high impact, low impact, whatever, which tends to put a very very qualitative lens on risk. But when we were talking pre-show, you talked about risk quantification. Can you share a little bit about what that actually looks like in practice? Because I think we're always trying to quantify things, and risk is not something that I think that normally comes to mind initially when we try to put a number on it. So what's your philosophy on that?
So I believe that there are some risks that are very easily quantified. I think of it like a sliding scale is probably the best way to think about it. There are some risks that are so hard to quantify, but there's still a good way to make sure that everybody's on the same page around what does a high risk mean versus a low risk. And I'm going to go off onto a side tangent for a moment because it's relevant here, is that every person has a personal preference towards our risk that we take. Okay. As entrepreneurs, you and I are higher risk takers.
Sure. Your tolerance, sure.
Exactly.
Yep.
So what to us would look like a very low risk to someone who is very risk averse would look very high.
Right.
So just using the labels of high, medium, or low, very bad. Because definitions are different. However, if you were to put criteria of what does this look like at the company level, what does this look like? It would look like this from a operational perspective, from a technology perspective, from a regulatory perspective, financial perspective. Here's what a higher risk would look like.
Right.
Here's what a moderate risk would look like. Here's what a low risk would look like. Now, personally, I think 3 levels is also too easy, and it's too. So I like using a 5-level scale, if at all possible, if I'm using that kind of criteria. So that is one way to quantify, because when you're putting that criteria in, you're saying it means we can't operate for 2 days, which or it could impact X number of policyholders or X percentage of our policyholders. We have a turnover rate, an involuntary turnover rate of X, right? We have a financial impact of this much net income loss or net loss. You can quantify what that looks like. So that's on one end of the spectrum for being able to quantify. Then you have those where you've got hard data from it's happened in the past. We know it can happen again. We need to look at that data from the past and say, what did it look like back then? What was the environment back then? And how do we make that look like today? and you can use that data to quantify what it could look like in the future.
Yeah.
So again, financial risk, because insurance carriers are very comfortable there. You could say if this happened, it would reduce okay, I'm going to state that better.
Yep, go for it.
Okay. If we were to do this, it would mean our premiums are reduced by $50 million.
Sure.
Okay. That's happened in the past. It happens. We weren't able to do that, but this is how many policies we had. And this is how much our book of business looked like at that point. We've grown since then. So we can't say 50 million is the same 10 years ago as it was today.
Sure.
Now that would look like 150 million. Okay. That's good to know. So you can quantify, and you could, the other piece of that is not just saying there's a single point of expected loss. There's going to be a range of losses.
Yeah.
On the high end, it could be here. On the low end, it can be here, but the expected loss is about right here. And there's different levels of confidence of I'm really confident it's here. And as it goes out to the outer bands, I have less confidence in that actually being actually coming true. So that's your sliding scale of being able to quantify. Definitely possible. Reputation gets to be one of those that's very hard to quantify, but there are metrics that you can use to measure reputation, net promoter score, Google reviews, the number of complaints that are filed with the regulators. Sure. There's all different kinds of ways to measure reputation. It just has to look at it from the 360-degree view.
Sure. Yeah. Sentiment analysis, CSAT, all that stuff. Yeah. No, that makes good sense. When you were describing it, one of the things that came to mind, and for all of the tech geeks out there that, kind of think in the terms of IT, I thought about particularly how we define incident severities. And so, there's a high critical severity, medium severity, et cetera. And I think back to some of these severities, talk about the number of users impacted with or without workaround. So that, so more than 1,000 users impact, no workaround, that becomes critical severity for an incident, right? So I would take that same thing, and am I thinking along the right lines where
yes,
I would take that approach and got it. Yep. So that makes a ton of sense, and something that, matter of fact, as I'm thinking about it, that's something that I can implement directly into what it is that we do and start thinking about that quantification, which ostensibly is much more objective, to your point, right? Because then I don't deal with the subjectivities around the tolerances. And so he's like, well, the CEO might think that that's critical, but it's really not critical, right? Because it's only is the only user that's impacted by this outage, that type of thing. No, that makes a ton of sense. I love that. One of the questions that I know we face in the IT sense, but I'd like to ask you to think about it in broader terms. We're constantly being asked to innovate. We're constantly being asked to come up with new ways of doing things, leverage new technologies. But obviously, inherent in all of that is a degree of risk. So how do you deal with your clients that are trying to balance that dynamic tension that invariably exists between innovation and appropriate risk management? What's your take on that?
So a lot of that is going to be first understanding the level of risk that the CEO, the board, investors are willing to take when it comes to innovation. Are you wanting, and even looking at your customer base, and your distribution model, how does all of that fit? If you have an older customer base, they're probably not going to want you to be really innovative.
Sure.
But if you're trying to market towards the younger insurance buyers, then they're going to expect you to be really innovative and be cutting edge, but still provide good customer service.
Right.
There's all those different elements. So you have to do that kind of analysis before really deciding how innovative are we going to be. So from that perspective, though, you also have to ask, do we as a company want to be the ones that are first out to market, knowing we're gonna discover all the problems with this, or are we okay being second to market and letting someone else find all the problems, and we come in and we are better than them. There's different case studies that have been shown in other. I'm going to use a non-insurance industry as an example, but you think about SanDisk and MP3 players. They came out with their little MP3 players. They were first out to market, very close leading edge. But then Apple came out. They came out with the
iPod.
Yes, thank you. I will confess I'm not an Apple person, so I had to pause for a moment. But they came out with their iPod, but it was only after different companies had already found all the problems.
That's right.
And they had perfected those problems when they released their iPod. So that's why their product lasted longer in the market and the other companies went away. So there's pros and cons for being first to market, and pros and cons for being not first, but definitely not last to market.
Yeah, that makes sense. It reminds me of I guess it was my marketing classes where we talked about the early adopters, we talked about the fast followers, we talked about the laggards, right? And so where does your company sit in terms of their risk appetite around innovation? And that's, I guess that's a really important thing to identify.
Also, something to think about is whether or not is there a market for what? Has the need been identified by the market already and you're trying to fill that need? Or have you identified the need, but the market hasn't, and you're going to have to create that need within the market? Because innovation can come at it from different perspectives, and the consumers, the policyholders may not realize that they want this or that they need this. But then once you start sharing it, they're like, oh, that's a really good idea. I like that. But if the need isn't there, then it's a harder sell.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. And it's funny because what you're scratching on is something that I might categorize as kind of the digital transformation, right? That a lot of carriers are undergoing right now to meet these potential customer needs, right? In a lot of cases, again, because the average insurance customer couldn't necessarily articulate exactly what they need around an insurance product. It's up to us to kind of innovate on our own. But as you think about digital transformation, and then that's like the buzzword, right? We're about to go to ITC next week here, and it's like, everything is digital transformation, right? Customer experience. What role do you see, Carol, playing from an ERM perspective as companies think about this digital transformation that many are already on the road to achieve? There are a lot of laggards out there, and that's what's keeping me in business. So what is the role really of ERM as companies think about their digital transformation journey?
Two perspectives. One, really getting companies to understand, if you haven't already started down that journey, what are the risks to your business being a going concern?
Yeah.
As well, from an operational perspective, if you want to grow, what is holding you back from that? And it's going to be your technology, because your technology will keep you from being able to scale effectively in your operational side. Most carriers are not willing to invest on the people side. And so if that's the case, you've got to pick and choose. Are you going to invest in the technology to support the growth, or are you going to invest in the people? You're going to have to pick and choose.
Right.
And even if you invest in the people side, there's still going to be the risks around the processes of scaling is going to be painful. Right. If your technology does not support the growth. So from an ERM perspective, we're going to ask those tough questions to leadership and say, what are the risks of not doing this? And let's talk about the risks of doing it. Which is the worst case scenario on both of those. And I don't know of any company that's going to say, you know what, I think I'd prefer not to do it. It becomes more a matter of timing. And because a lot of them are scared about the long term, so many digital transformation projects, as you know, are longer term, just because companies can't do it quickly. And there's a whole story that I'm sure you can tell tons of stories on. But the long-term view scares companies because then they're having to make a big commitment. And we need to figure out a way from a risk perspective and from a strategy perspective to break it into bite-sized chunks that make it more tolerable. That is one of those pieces that will help carriers be more willing to do digital transformation projects at a faster pace, is
Yeah.
bite size, because we can all tolerate bite size projects. It's the big ones that scare us.
I love that, Carol, because what the dots that I'm connecting now, it's the opportunity to bring ERM into program execution. And what you just decoded for me is a use of ERM that I wouldn't have thought of it. I think about ERM as, and forgive me, I think of it as a blocker. Like say, like don't do this because this bad stuff will happen. As opposed to what you've just opened up for me is use ERM as a tool to find a more manageable way to execute.
Yeah, ERM should be an enabler. We shouldn't be a naysayer, right?
Yeah.
I want to enable the business to succeed. That is all that ERM should be about. The phrase that is coming to mind right now is ERM should move at the speed of business. The business is moving fast. The environment in which any company is operating, carrier or not, is so fast and so volatile. There's so much uncertainty around it. ERM cannot take the role of, I know you're in the middle of making this decision, but you can't pause for 2 weeks. I need you to pause for 2 weeks while we conduct this risk assessment, and then we'll come back to you. That is not going to fly in no way, shape, or form. And so it's more about embedding ERM into the decision making on a rapid fire basis so that management is more confident in their decisions, and that they're in confidence in achieving the goals and the objectives that they've set forth. You want to keep increasing it, right? You want to keep increasing their confidence. That is the best way to do it.
So what I guess I'm reading in there, first off, I'm reading that as hard, because I feel like that requires a cultural shift. Starting at the exam, am I hitting that right? It's a culture change that you're asking for. It's not even just like learn a new trick. I mean, this is like you want me to now bring ERM into not even as a program, but into my thinking.
Absolutely.
How do you get a customer to wrap their head around that?
Starts at the top. It's
Right.
always starts at the top. And it truly, good ERM starts with culture and people.
Yeah.
Any company, it starts culture and people. And so if you've got leadership that's willing to hear tough news and responds appropriately to it, so that they're not going to punish somebody who gives them but what about this? Have you guys thought about this? And when leadership gets challenged on, you know what, I didn't think of everything. It's okay, because we're all human. It doesn't matter what title you have, what role you play, we're all human. So from a culture perspective, we got to be willing to accept that we don't know it all.
Right.
That may be more challenging for some than others. I recognize that.
Without a doubt. Without a doubt.
But we're all human. And I think, especially in today's world, employees appreciate a CEO who accepts that they're human. Right. And that they're not all-knowing. It's okay. It's okay, because that means the input from the employees is that much more valuable.
Yeah.
To the way that the company is doing business. So starting at the top, changing leadership's mindset around them and their role and how they interact with others is so critical. So as a leader, don't fly off the handle when somebody brings you bad news.
Sure.
First step in the journey.
Yep. Starts with that. And it's funny, and it's intuitive to an extent, because so much of what we were talking about in terms of these transformations, these cultural transformations, et cetera, they all require the same thing. It's a shift in mindset that has to start at the top, where there's a leader that's setting the example for this type of work. That's a great point. Let me ask you to pull out the crystal ball here, Carol. As you look into your crystal ball, what are some of the changes to ERM and the assessment and evaluation of risk that you see coming as we there's the obvious things as we prepare for a Cat 4 landfall here in the next couple of days. But as you look even beyond just the weather risk and environmental risk and all that, what are some of the other things that you think we need to be thinking about as an industry and build into our thinking from an ERM perspective?
Our people, I think we need to be more open to, and I know it's top of mind on the talent side, but being open to getting people from non-insurance fields and bringing them in, because I have seen tremendous capabilities by people who are bringing different perspectives from all these different industries. And they come into the insurance world and they ask great questions,
right?
Because they're not making assumptions that those of us who've been in the insurance industry make day in and day out.
That's right.
We need to recognize that other industries are further ahead in some areas than the insurance world. And what is the value that we can bring? It's a thought.
Yeah.
So that would be one of those kind of crystal balls. The other is taking ERM from being this bureaucratic process that a carrier does because the regulator requires us to do it, or our board says we need to do ERM. So we've got this risk committee and it meets on a quarterly basis and we get our occasional risk reports, and that's how we manage risk. That does not align with the speed at which business is working nowadays. And so taking risk from doing that to being part of how the business is run,
right,
is the next piece of the puzzle.
Got it. Yeah, no, that makes a ton of sense. So that gives me the opportunity to bring it all the way back around now, Carol, and ask, as you think about, that future focus and some of the other things that you've talked about, tell me a little bit about how SDS kind of engages and kind of what your core value proposition is as a firm, you differentiators. Take a couple minutes here to kind of sell the audience on the value you bring to the table.
Well, now I gave you the kind of high level overview of my background.
Right.
So we're bringing that insurance knowledge to the table. However, my team is made up of cross industry, ERM professionals, strategy professionals coming to the table. So they ask really great questions and they're so smart. But from an ERM perspective, we are all about taking ERM from being just the governance bureaucratic process and helping companies embed it into their day-to-day decision-making and resource allocation. Because at the end of the day, it's all about increasing the leader's confidence and achieving their goals and objectives. So that means being aware and being mindful of what risk can be taken, should be taken, how much risk, and in what areas. So helping companies get all of that information to influence their decision making.
How should executives think about the ROI, if you will, of an ERM program? Is there a formula to actually create a business case? Because you mentioned, having to install this, from a resource perspective, from a structural perspective. How do I think about this as a CEO around the type of return that I get from having a well-defined ERM program?
So it's a great question, and it's one that gets asked all the time because there is no formula. The reality is that it's really hard to measure what we help companies prevent or minimize, help them manage risk better. So that's a struggle to be able to say, yeah, we can measure what didn't happen. Not really. But what we can do is say that when you look over time, the performance of the company is improving. Now, I can give a case study real quick to demonstrate that from an ERM perspective. I had a client that brought me in. They were struggling to operate as a leadership and as a company. They weren't achieving their goals. They weren't getting projects done on time. They were really just struggling operationally. When I came in and looked at everything, there were a ton of things that were going wrong operationally. From a risk lens, I helped them address those areas so that in the future, here are the levers that you guys need to pull. Right. And we installed very specific things in place to to prevent them from happening again in the future. That company has gone from struggling and having losses on a quarterly basis to thriving as a company, and their leadership works so much better now together, very collaboratively. They're achieving their goals. They're getting their projects done. They are moving forward, and their company, their employees are thrilled to be there because they see the value of what they're doing. So to have that kind of shift is a demonstration of the business case.
I love that. A couple of takeaways for me on that point is one where, and I think we see this in other areas, companies that do this are more likely to succeed, right? Companies that have these types of programs are more likely to succeed.
When done well.
When done well, exactly. I mean, DEI is now a taboo word, but I remember back in, when DEI was first coming up, they said companies with DEI programs succeed, are more successful, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's a kind of an interesting thing. Hopefully, what happened to DEI doesn't happen to ERM.
Well, and that kind of goes to the point of being done well versus not being done well.
You got it.
And to our earlier point of, you don't want it to be bureaucratic. You want it to be embedded in the business.
Yes.
And making sure that you're shifting that culture. The mindset, it's a mindset piece. And so as long as that becomes natural to the company, you're golden. But if it's a bureaucratic check the box,
you got it,
then it's not going to fit well, and it's not going to work within the company. And so there's a lot of programs where that has happened. And companies did it because we're doing it because the investors want us to, or we're doing it because the regulators tell us to, not because we believe in it. When you believe in it, it becomes part of the day-to-day, and there is no question around how we're doing something. It's just part of the conversation.
Yeah. I think ESG is another great example of that, right? Where companies kind of just like, oh, all we need is daggone ESG statement. Well, I mean, don't do it. If that's what it's for, then don't do it. If it's something that you're going to embed and be passionate about, and there's a good end to it, then makes good sense.
Yep.
Love that. Well, Carol, thank you so much for taking the time. I've learned every time I get on the phone with you, I learn an incredible amount. So thank you. And at least this time we got to record it for not only for posterity, but for the rest of the audience to hear about it. So if you've got any questions around risk, you know where to go. strategicdecisionsolutions.com. We've got it. I had to say it with the radio voice. Otherwise it's not official. So perfect. No, great.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
I appreciate you.
Thank you for joining this episode of 5 Minutes. If you've enjoyed our discussion, we'd love for you to share it with anyone else you think might find it interesting. Also, please subscribe on whatever podcast platform you're listening on and hit that bell to stay on top of the game with our practical 5-minute episodes. We look forward to seeing you again next week.